Hello confirmation friends, welcome to this confirmation instructional video for assignment number 3. Welcome, thank you so much for taking this time to continue learning about the story of the Bible. I gave you the opportunity to read Manna and Mercy chapter 2 this week, as well as a couple of relatively brief biblical passages. The story, though, is quite large, and so I'm going to summarize this part of the story for you in this video so that you continue getting a good sense of the entire biblical story. Last week, you remember, we summarized Genesis chapters 1 to 12, the first 12 chapters of the Bible. These are set in very long ago times, perhaps somewhat mythical times, and they tell stories that are not necessarily rooted in history, although they might be, but the truth of these stories is in the truths that they tell us. For example, perhaps the most important truth we learned last week is what human beings are for. As we learned in the very beginning, when God created this world, the story goes, God created safe places for all living creatures, a huge diversity of living creatures to be safe and to live in. And then God created these creatures to populate these safe places. Then finally, God created human beings in God's own image or likeness, which tells us that human beings were created to what? Create safe places for all living things. That's what we do. And God also told us to help us look after these beautiful, safe places we call the earth. So that's our job, to help God create safe places for all living things, to look after the earth and all the creatures in it. We are participants with God in caring for this world and every person in it. That's our purpose. Well, for the first couple chapters of the Bible, everything is very beautiful. As we noted last week, it's a beautiful, diverse, wondrous, life-filled creation full of blessing and joy and peace and harmony. There's a wonderful biblical word for that called shalom that we'll get to that later. Peace, well-being. But it doesn't last long because the people no longer want to be participants, co-participants with God and caring for all that is. They want to strike out on their own. They want to become gods unto themselves. They want to run the show, and that is when disaster strikes. They become big deals to one another. They start to lord it over one another. They lie and deceive one another. Eventually, the first murder happens, and everything spirals out of control from there. God, at some points, regrets having made the human beings for all the trouble they caused, contemplates destroying the whole world, just about does in the big flood. Saves some people and 2 of every living creature out of that flood to move forward in the story. But after the flood subsides, God does regret the violence that God has done to the earth and to most of its living creatures, and promises never to do it again. And the sign of that promise is the rainbow in the sky. God hangs God's bow, God's weapon, in the sky, promising never to try and get things back on track again through violence. God has to think up of a new way of getting along with people and of moving the story forward so that the earth can become the place God intended from the very beginning, a place of peace, harmony, well-being, a place of shalom. Well, descended from Noah, the person whose family survived the flood, eventually is a person named Abraham. And God one day comes up with a new plan to save the earth and to bring creation to where God wants it to be. And the plan is to form a relationship with one person and that person's family, a relationship of blessing where God would bless this person with everything good so that this person and his family could then share that blessing with all the other creatures and all the other peoples of the earth. So the blessing would come down by God to this one family, and then the blessings would go out to everyone and to the whole earth. And in this way, God would bring the world and the whole creation back to that place where God intends. Well, that is the rest of the story of the Bible, the story of this people, descended from Abraham, who were called to be a people of blessing. The story is a bit of a rocky one. Sometimes the people are great at being blessing, and sometimes the people aren't. But God's promise to be blessing to them never wavers. God is always faithful to that promise. So Abraham's father was named Terah, and here's a map of the Holy Land is over here. There's the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. So that's way over here. This is the Mediterranean Sea here. Over here is the Tigris and Euphrates River, sometimes called the cradle of civilization. Now this is where Terah lived and his family. They lived way over here. And one day he decided to go to a place called Haran, way up here. These people moved all the way up here. So Terah and his family, along with Abram and his wife Sarai, they all moved up to here to Haran, and that's where they stopped. But one day God came to Abram and said, Abram, I want you to go to a place that I will show you. And I will bless you with everything good. And in turn, you will bless all the peoples of the earth. So that was the very beginning of God's plan at the beginning of Genesis chapter 12. So the land that God showed him God eventually led him right down here to the promised land, the Holy Land, right around here, right by that place we know so well from all of our Bible stories, called the land of Canaan at the time. And that's where Abram settled. For a while there was a famine in the land and he had to go down to Egypt over here, but eventually he came back and settled right in there. So that's where eventually God showed Abram to. Now, Abraham lived there, and we don't go into much of it in the readings, but God obviously intended that Abraham have many descendants so that they could be the people of blessing in the story, right? Well, Abraham got older and older and had no son, so eventually he took matters into his own hands and had a son with his wife's servant, his wife Sarah's servant. Now, back in the day, that was an okay thing to do if you needed an heir. You could take your wife's servant and have an heir that way. So that servant's name was Hagar. She had a very special son. She and Abraham had a very special son named Ishmael. Now, this is a whole other story that we'll get to next year in the second year of confirmation class, but from Ishmael are descended our Muslim friends, our people whose faith is called Islam. Now, that is a very important part of the story, and I want you to just tuck that away for right now because we will come back to it next year. Nevertheless, eventually, God told Abraham to just promise that a son would come to him and his wife Sarah. And eventually, when they were very old, Abraham and Sarah had a son named Isaac. Now, Isaac eventually took a wife named Rebekah. And they had two sons, Esau, right there, and Jacob. Esau and Jacob. And the blessing was going to come through Jacob. Jacob had two wives, Rachel and Leah, because back in biblical times, it was common for husbands to sometimes have more than one wife. Now, another name for Jacob, a nickname he eventually got, was Israel. So when we talk about the people of Israel, we are talking about people descended from Jacob. So you might want to remember that. That's a helpful thing to know. Because between his two wives, Rachel and Leah, Jacob had 12 sons. And from these sons were descended all the 12 tribes of Israel, the eventual famous 12 tribes, because there were 12 sons, and their families became the 12 tribes of Israel, which is another name for Jacob. So that is just so you can sort of keep it all in your mind. That is kind of the family tree of this part of the story. So I hope that that is helpful to you. Now, as I say here, eventually, descendants of the 12 tribes become slaves in Egypt. The story of how they ended up in Egypt, again, has to do with famine in their land. They were hungry. looking for food eventually. And through many twists and turns, one of those brothers, one of those sons of Jacob, ended up in Egypt as a very important person, Joseph. And so that's a long story, which I hope we'll be able to tell each other one time. You can read it in Genesis if you like. But eventually Joseph invites all of his brothers to come down and settle in Egypt, where there is lots of food. That's how they end up in Egypt. But over time, after Jacob and the Pharaoh, or the emperor of Egypt, die, and they don't know the people in charge anymore, all these descendants of the 12 tribes, these people, the Israelites, become enslaved by the Egyptians. They're foreigners, and they are exploited by the Egyptians, and for many, many, many years suffer under slavery in Egypt. So in your book, Manna and Mercy, there is a very nice drawing of the kind of society that is. So if you look on page 4 here at your book, you can see that this is a very hierarchically structured society. Pharaoh is at the top, and he's kind of a god figure, okay? He is like a god in this way of thinking. And the whole system is supported by the priesthood or religion on one hand that worships Pharaoh as a god, and supported by, on the other hand, the military, which enforces order. So just below Pharaoh is the royal family. Just below them are the administrators and other big deals. Then there are ordinary citizens, farmers, traders, craftspeople, etc. But by far, the most amount of people are at the very bottom, and they have very little, and they are exploited for their labor, and they are considered property and not treated as human beings by the rest, and they are simply slaves. And they lead a terrible, terrible life. And among these slaves are the Israelites in this system. So here we have a very hierarchical system where the big deal is at the top, the little deals at the bottom, and most of the people down here are supporting the very few people up here through their labor. That's the way this system works. And as it says in Manna and Mercy, God hates this system. God hates the way this society is structured. God cannot stand this. God detests that way of structuring the society, because so many people suffer in it. And so many people are exploited. So when the people cry out for help, and I've given you that little reading from Exodus where the people cry out to God for help to set them free, God hears them. That is the kind of call for help God will respond to, because God hates that system. And so God eventually leads them to freedom. In order to do that, the people need a leader. And so God calls a person named Moses. And Moses' brother Aaron, and Moses' sister Miriam. And these three lead the people out of slavery, from Egypt into freedom. Again, it's another amazing story in the Bible. Perhaps some of you have seen the old movie with Charlton Heston as Moses, called The Ten Commandments, a movie made by Cecil B. DeMille. We also sometimes at Christmas watch Prince of Egypt, which is another telling of this story. So maybe if you want to watch those sometime, that will give you a good sense of what's going on in this amazing story. But for now, I will show you that on another map here, here's again the Mediterranean Sea, the Promised Land is up here. Here is Egypt, okay? Here is the Arabian Peninsula here, or the wilderness. It's the peninsula here, the wilderness of Paran on this map. Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula, is down over here. This is the Sinai is another name for this here. Anyway, the people are here, and if you can see the red line on the map, Moses eventually, God sends plagues to the Egyptians and to Pharaoh that are so bad because Moses keeps insisting that Pharaoh let his people go. Pharaoh says no, so God sends some bad plagues. They get progressively worse and worse and worse. And eventually Pharaoh says, just get out of here. Just leave already. So Moses takes the people, takes them on a route over here, and here's the Red Sea. And at some low point back in the day here is where the people crossed from the Red Sea over to freedom, over in this part here. So you might know the story. It's a famous story. God sends a great wind that kind of separates the water for them so that they can walk through on dry land to the other side. But Pharaoh changes his mind and sends his warriors in chariots to bring the people back. And so just in the nick of time, the Israelites get through the water on the dry land. But as the chariots come after him, the water collapses again and drowns all the people in the chariots chasing the Israelites. So the Israelites safely get through to the other side here. Now they enter the wilderness here. And they wander in this wilderness here for 40 years. They are there a long time, like an entire generation of people. They eventually wander down to this part where Mount Sinai is, where God gives them some very special instruction for their life together as a people. We'll get to more of that next time. But for now, the important point is for you to realize that they go from slavery to freedom through the waters of the Red Sea. They cross the waters from slavery into freedom. Now, God doesn't take them to the promised land yet. God has things to teach them, right? They've been in Egypt for generations and generations. All they know about how to live together as a people and as a society is this, right? The temptation for them to do then would be to just recreate this system where they are at the top instead of the Egyptians and instead of Pharaoh, right? And have their own slaves and people under them. So God realizes that God is going to have to do some pretty serious teaching in order for them to be the people of blessing God is calling them to be. There's not a lot of blessing for the people down here in this system, right? So God has to teach them a new way to be a society, a new way to be people in the world dedicated to the well-being and the safety of all living things, because that's the idea, right? So God realizes God is going to have to do some teaching. So this wilderness here is really where the people go to school. And that's what will be the focus of the next week's assignment is called Wilderness School. That's chapter 3 of Manna and Mercy. This is where they learn what it is God wants them to know in order to be the people of blessing. So if you go to page 6 in Manna and Mercy, God's plan is outlined there, right? On page 6, there's a nice plan, and I'll summarize that plan for you now because it's very important that you understand God's plan for the people. So the plan is for God to tenderly raise the children, the people, teach them to live as partners with God. Teach them to live as partners with God. So God brought forth a child through the waters of the Red Sea. God will raise the child people and teach them to live as partners with God. That is the first part of the plan. The second part of the plan is that the other nations will see how they live and they will want to do likewise because it is such a beautiful way to live together. So once they start living in a way that's different from Pharaoh's Egypt, other nations will look at them and think, wow, that is an amazing way to live. Please teach us how to do that. So then the third part of the plan is that when the nations learn to live as partners with one another and with God, the day of shalom or peace will come to the whole world. So now you can see this is how God's amazing plan to mend the entire universe unfolds. This is the heart of the plan. Teach the people to live as partners with God. Other people will see that. Other nations will see it and want to live like that. And so when all the nations learn to live as partners with God and with one another, the day of shalom or peace will come to the whole world. Shalom, the day of shalom, the day of peace. This is a very important word in Hebrew and in the Bible. It's often translated as peace, but it kind of means much more than our word peace means. It means peace for sure, as we mean it, but it also means health, physical health, mental health, societal health. It means safety, safety for everyone in society, feeling safe and secure inside as well as outside for your physical well-being. And so it does include well-being of all kinds, mental well-being, emotional well-being, physical well-being. That is the shalom. It means security in so many ways. You don't have to worry. It means a lack of anxiety. It means you are not worried that you will have enough to eat. It means food security. It means knowing that you will be looked after. So shalom is a huge, beautiful concept. And this is where God would like this plan to end up for everybody on the planet, in shalom, in peace. And so we long for the day of shalom, the day of peace. And God is going to teach the child people everything they need to know in the wilderness. They'll be there for 40 years. It's a long time to be in school. It's even longer than me. I think I was in school till I was 33, so maybe I'm just a slow learner. Anyway, I'm sharing with you some of what I've learned. So that gets us to this point in the story. Next time, we will be thinking about wilderness school. I hope you've enjoyed this. I'm trying to make it as entertaining as I can, but I also want you to have a good sense of the biblical story. So that's the foundation. We're going to move the story forward again next time. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and for doing the readings. I'm proud of you all. I love you all. I miss you all. Be well, friends. Until next week. Bye-bye.